How can Christianity bring any form of meaningful benefit during a season like the COVID-19 world pandemic? I get that many people probably are just left scratching their head. How can believing in God, how can going to church, how can being a Christian add any value while I'm going through or walking through loss? How does it help me if I've lost my job? How does it help me if my 401k is just tanked? How does it help me if my retirement is ruined? How does it help me if someone I care about is dying? How does Christianity help me if so much of what I've worked for and strived to achieve is now gone or wasted or destroyed because of this world pandemic? How and in any way does Christianity add value to me while I'm in the midst of those moments? And here's what I think is just a common thing. This is not a religious thing. This is not a Christian thing. Anyone who studies happiness recognizes that happiness and joy are always the byproduct of something. We get happiness and joy because we get to experience something, whether it's an experience of a romantic relationship or possessing something that we've worked hard to achieve, or it's a sport that we enjoy, or it's some sort of activity or hobby that brings happiness to us, or it's just a relationship with a friend that we have in our life. It's always the byproduct of something. You can't simply have happiness apart from something else. In fact, some of the most miserable people in the world that you and I have ever interacted with are people who don't understand this. They want to be happy and they neglect the fact that happiness is always the byproduct of something. So they want the outcome while neglecting the process, which always leads to a miserable, unhappy life. For many of us, we've made the epicenter of our happiness something that is either imperfect or it's temporary. And so the source of our happiness could be our job. It could be a promotion. It could be a relationship with a fallible person who's one day going to let us down. It could be our economic status. It could be our home. It could be the things that we possess. And so we place our happiness on the weight of something that could be breakable, could be erodable, could be destroyable, that's ultimately out of our control. In fact, Jesus recognized the tension that we have with our happiness, that it's a byproduct of something. In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, one of the things that he encourages people to do is he says, hey, don't store up for yourself your treasure in earthly things, things that can rot and be destroyed or be stolen from you. And that's where we're at right now. We've got so many sources of our happiness that are literally falling apart in front of us. Jobs that are eroding, income that's going away, our standard of living, which is just being evaporated and taken from us as the economy is starting to fall apart around us. I mean, so many of the things and sources of our happiness are being taken away and destroyed. Jesus' words are literally coming true. That's maybe why you're losing sleep right now, because you recognize, I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills. I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford the things that I used to enjoy. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have the job that I liked anymore. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find a job where I can pay those bills anymore. And so we're in a place where we've started to store up for ourselves treasure in things that are imperfect, that are erodable, that are stealable, that are destroyable, that are ultimately not strong enough to be able to hold the weight of our joy and our happiness long term. That's why a little bit later in a similar verse in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, but instead store up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust and thieves cannot destroy. Now, he's not saying that somehow we can create these like spiritual riches for ourselves by doing spiritual religious activity. That's not what he's getting at. But what he's trying to say is that when we devote our life to something, when we give our heart to something, we're storing our treasure for it. In fact, he talks about that explicitly later. He says, for where your heart is, there your treasure will be. And so what he's saying is here is that our hearts are directly connected to and related to the source of our joy and our happiness. And what Jesus is saying is be really careful with where you place the source of your happiness, because you've placed it in something that is the product of our economy, or the product of a job that you can't control, or the product of other people's opinions, or the relationship with someone who is imperfect or fallible. Then you're setting yourself up to damage your heart, to damage yourself, to make the source of your happiness and your joy ultimately fleeting. And then he says something that's really difficult for us to often understand. Jesus talks about this idea of wherever you set your eyes onto, it's kind of like a gateway to your soul. And if your eyes are good, your soul is filled with light. And if your eyes are dark, then your soul is filled with darkness. And this is what he's getting at in that chapter in Matthew chapter 6. That the thing that we set our eyes to, that we gaze on, that captures our imagination, our dreams, and our focus, that ultimately is what will feed our soul. And so for many of us, our eyes are focused on our job, they're focused on our finances, they're focused on that romantic relationship, they're focused on something that ultimately is out of our control and is ultimately imperfect, temporary, and potentially self-destructive. And so what Jesus is saying is here, the source of your joy, your inner source of joy and peace and goodness and patience is connected to the hopes and dreams of your life as expressed by what you're setting your eyes onto. And so what the Christian does is a Christian recognizes that the source of what I'm going to focus on is actually the work and presence of Jesus in my life. Now, I know a lot of religious people, their joy and their happiness really is material possessions, comfort, convenience, safety, all the things that you and I normally would gravitate towards. That's because they're not actually practicing the words and ways of Jesus. And that's just honestly cultural religiosity. That's not biblical Christianity as Jesus has laid out. So if you've rejected what you've seen, it could be that you've rejected a counterfeit form of Christianity. Now, I get when I talk about trusting Jesus, that may be confusing. And I really mean more than just believing that God exists. Trusting Jesus means that I actually submit the authority of my life to Him. I choose His ways over my ways. I choose His values over my values. I choose to see the world through the lens of what He says is true and not seeing the world through the lens of how the rest of my culture says is true, how I naturally would think is true. It's all of these things that combined on one another, it moves the source of our happiness from being in our possessions, our stuff, our comfort, and our convenience, and slowly moves them to start to get connected with Jesus. Because here's what we've been talking about, that when I connect the source of my happiness to something that's unstable, ultimately my joy and my happiness will be unstable. But if I connect my source of my happiness to something that's eternal and that has given itself in sacrifice for me, then I'm connecting my joy and my happiness into a source that is ultimately unshakable, unstealable, unerodible, and is ultimately incredibly powerful. But how exactly does that work? Well, I've got a question for you. Have you ever experienced a joy and happiness of love? What is actually happening in that moment we're experiencing the joy of love? We're experiencing the byproduct of being known by someone and knowing someone. And that's what happens. That's what the source of what that joy comes from. Now, the same thing is true when it comes to trusting in Jesus. We get known by Jesus and we express that through obedience to Him. And on top of it, we get to know Him. And the more I get to know Him, the more I know myself. One Christian theologian put it this way: there's no knowledge of God without knowledge of self. And there's no knowledge of self without knowledge of God. What he's getting at here is that I actually become a truer, more real person the more I get to know God, because it allows me to reinterpret myself and see myself as I actually am. Not only are we fully known by Jesus, which is incredibly comforting and intimate and joy-filled, but we're fully accepted in Jesus, which is a source of security and comfort and patience and goodness and satisfaction. Now, when we experience love in a romantic relationship or in a friendship, right, we're experiencing an imperfect form of love. That relationship's gonna fall apart from time to time. That relationship always isn't gonna be right. But when we experience love with a true source of love, one that's never ending, one that is perfect rather than imperfect, what we're doing is we're connecting our soul, the deepest part of who we are, to a source of joy and happiness that is inexhaustible and perfect in every single way. There's a Christian theologian named Henry Nouwen who talked about the transformative power of what this looks like. And I want to read it for you. Henry Nouwen said this: "But this intimate experience in which every bit of life is touched by a bit of death can point us beyond the limits of our existence." He's saying that when we get in touch with this moment where we recognize that my happiness and my joy is insecure, it's connected to something that is touched by death, it's imperfect, it's fallible, it will eventually go away one day. He says that actually causes us to look past ourselves, which is maybe something that you're experiencing right now during this COVID-19 world pandemic, where you're recognizing that you're longing to connect with something beyond yourself. He continues, "The thing about this is it can do so by making us look forward to an expectation, to a day when our hearts will be filled with perfect joy, and that joy no one shall take away from us." What he's getting at is here is when we go through the experience of connecting our joy and our happiness to something that's imperfect, that fails us, it creates an appetite in us to look forward to a source where that won't happen to us. And that's exactly what God may be doing in you and in me during this season, where we're recognizing that our source of joy has been disconnected from something eternal and connected to something that's temporary. And what Henry Nouwen is saying is that that longing inside of us is longing for something more, and it's something that God created in you. It's not defective, it's not wishful thinking. You're longing for something that you were made for, which is to be known by God, to love God, to express your love for God through obedience, and then to be accepted affected by him in the same process. And that is a transformative experience. We sing about the transformative power of love in our culture all the time. So many of our songs and movies are about how love transforms people. We know this intuitively. This is not a religious thing. This is just a people thing. What Henry Nouwen is saying is he's echoing the words of Jesus, that when you connect your heart to something temporary, your happiness will always be temporary. But when you connect your heart to something eternal, you can have a source of joy and happiness and satisfaction that is eternal. And that, my friends, is how Christianity has something to offer you, me, and the world during this great time. Now, I get that there's still more questions and more things, but this is just the third part of our conversation that we're talking about when it comes to how Christianity can interact with COVID-19 and the world pandemic that is known as coronavirus. I hope you continue in this conversation. I'd love to hear your questions, your concerns, even things that don't make sense to you. Feel free to put those in comments or email me at questions@postchristian.cc. I'd love to interact with you and hear what you're thinking, not because I'm interested in debating anybody, but because I genuinely want to hear from what people are thinking and processing as they're interacting with this content. Thanks so much. Hopefully I'll talk to you soon. Bye.